Today we're going to discuss a very important poker concept you must fully understand if you want to have any chance to succeed at poker. And that is that you should play wider ranges when you are in position compared to when you are out of position. Position is power in No Limit Texas Hold'em because it primarily lets you do two things because you get to act last. Whenever you're last to act, you get to better control the size of the pot compared to when you are out of position. For example, if you are first to act on the river and you have the nuts, you have two options. You can either bet or you can check, looking to check raise. If you check and your opponent checks behind, you don't get to get any money in the pot with the nuts, which is bad. If you bet, your opponent can either call or fold, but there's certainly no guarantee they're going to raise and put money in the pot, right? Compare this to what happens when you're in position. If your opponent bets into you on the river, you can then raise for sure, and you get to make the pot big. And if your opponent checks on the river, you can bet and put money in the pot. So this essentially results in the player in position being able to put in one additional bet. And in a game where a bet can be all of your money, like No Limit Texas Hold'em, this is very, very valuable. Also, being in position gives you more information about your opponent's range. And this is more and more and more true as your opponent plays more and more straightforwardly. For example, say you're against someone who plays pretty straightforwardly on the river. When they bet the river, they always have a hand they think wins at the showdown. Well, what should you do with all your bluff catchers, like middle pair? You should fold, right? What if instead, when your opponent checks the river, they always have nothing? They just plan on giving up. Well, with your hands that cannot beat nothing, you certainly want to be bluffing, right? So you get a very obvious bluffing opportunity. Essentially, the more information you have about the strategy your opponent has, the better you can take advantage of that information. And when your opponent acts first, you get one more data point about what your opponent is potentially doing. So these two factors make you way more inclined to play more hands in position compared to out of position. Let's go through some examples. Before the flop, let's take a look at a scenario where the under the gun player 8-handed raises. So they're first to act, playing 100 big blinds deep. If you are in the low jack seat, this is how you should play. The low jack would be first to act if there were 6 players yet to act. So the low jack has the hijack, cutoff, button, small blind, and big blind yet to act. Here's how you should act from the button. Notice from the low jack seat, you should fold a ton. To be clear, we're folding a ton because the initial raiser is really strong, but also we're only being able to play 8% of hands, which is almost nothing. From the button, though, you get to play about 11.5% of hands, which is roughly 50% more hands from the button compared to the low jack. And this will be even more clear if you look at spots where, let's say, the hijack raises, and then you're comparing, let's say, the cutoff or the button. But I wanted to show you this spot because it illustrates that you get to play like 50% more hands, which is a lot. 50% meaning 12% compared to 8%, right? So essentially, when someone raises, as you are in later and later position towards the button, you get to play wider and wider ranges. Now, some people think that you get to play really wide from the small blind to the big blind because those are even closer to last to act before the flop, but those are going to be first to act after the flop, which is really, really bad. So the small blind very often has to play incredibly tightly, and the big blind gets to splash around a bit because they're closing the action pre-flop and getting very good odds, but they certainly can't play anywhere near any two cards. Let's take a look at a spot where now the hijack raises, the cutoff calls, and then the button 3-bets. So say it goes 3 big blinds, call, and the button makes it 12. Okay? Notice the hijack, what I really want to focus on is their calling range. They get to call with 20 combination of hands, 19.98. Whereas if the hijack folds, the cutoff then gets to call with 30 combination of hands, which is a lot more combinations of hands. Take a look at the hands that the cutoff gets to call with that the hijack does not. Notice the cutoff gets to call ace-jack suited, king-jack suited, some jack-10 suited, a decent chunk of pocket pairs, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, ace-5 suited, whereas the hijack player has to fold those hands a decent chunk of the time. Now, these ranges are very, very tight. It's because they presume everyone's playing good, strong GTO poker, but this concept still applies if the ranges were wider. The hijack has to fear calling because the cutoff can then re-raise, which would, of course, ruin the hijack safe. They had a hand like Jack 10 suited, right? They just have to fold it. And also, they're going to be out of position against the button, which is not good. In this scenario, both players have to play quite tightly. Let's compare this to a different spot, though, where it goes, let's say, hijack raises to 3 big blinds, cutoff calls, and then the big blind 3 bets to, let's say, 14 big blinds. Now, notice both players' calling ranges are much wider, 46 combination of hands, because they are now going to be in position against the big blind 3-better, right? So when the 3-better is out of position, you now get to call with a substantially wider range. So notice the hijack is calling 46 combinations of hands instead of 20, right? And the cutoff gets to call with 44 combinations compared to 30. So in this scenario, in both spots, the in-position players get to play wider ranges because they are in position. And again, this concept is going to apply in literally every single pre-flop situation. When you are in position, you get to play wider than when you are out of position. This also applies post-flop too. Again, position is power, and this matters because from out of position, you are going to under-realize your equity. What I mean by that is, say someone raises and you call in the big blind, and you flop bottom pair. You check, your opponent bets, you're probably going to call. On the turn, if you check and your opponent bets again on pretty much any turn, unless you improve, you are not loving it, right? And you're often going to have to fold your bottom pair. Or say you do call again and on the river, you check and your opponent blasts it, you're definitely going to fold your bottom pair, right? So you have to fold out a hand that will be winning some portion of the time. If you're in position, though, you, again, get to make better decisions about your opponent's range because you have additional information about the strategy they have used so far, right? And also, your opponent has to be more cautious because you have the opportunity to raise them with your good hands, which means they're going to be checking more often. Because your opponent has to check more often, you're going to be able to check it down with your hands like bottom pair and win at the showdown a decent chunk of the time. So you're going to find that when you're out of position, you're usually overfolding compared to the minimum defense frequency, which is a number that says how much you should defend if you're trying to be unexploitable, but it doesn't necessarily apply post-flop. Basically, it is a number that's, roughly how much is a reasonable amount to defend if there was no more betting. But there is more betting, so it doesn't really apply. You're going to be overfolding when you're out of position and often overcalling when you are in position. So you get to call wider when you're in position post-flop. Let's take a look at an example. Here we have a spot where the low jack raises and the button calls. And over here we have a spot where the low jack raises and the big blind calls, 40 big blinds deep. We have the same flop, king of spades, 10 of spades, 3 of hearts. In both scenarios, the low jack is going to bet 25% pot with the game theory optimal range. Here's how the button should play over here. Here's how the big blind should play over here. Now, I realize these ranges are very different, right? The player on the button has a much stronger range than the player in the big blind. So you can't just say, oh, look, player on the button only folds 20% and the player in the big blind folds 47% because the big blind has a whole lot of garbage, right? But what you can really focus on is you can look at the hands that are perhaps raising from out of position or folding that are calling or not folding from in position. So take a look at hands like ace 4. Notice ace 4. About half of them are calling when you are in position on the button. That is ace 4 of spades and ace 4 of hearts for backdoor flush draw. Notice when you are out of position, though, you have to raise the ace 4 of spades and you cannot call the ace 4 of hearts. And that's the same thing for like ace 5, right? So, and same thing for ace 2. So you see, these types of hands get to call in position a little bit more often. Also notice hands like jack 8 in position with hearts is calling the majority of the time, right? Notice that pocket 5s gets to call a little bit more often when you're in position compared to when you're out of position. And these scenarios where you're calling like a little bit more may not seem like they're that big of a deal, but they really are. You get to play by calling more often when you're in position compared to when you're out of position. And also, you'll generally find that when you're out of position facing a bet, you will typically do a decent amount more raising. This example is not the most beautiful example of this because we're raising, 15% of the time compared to 14.8. But notice hands like king, queen, king, jack, king 10 are raising more often from out of position compared to when you are in position. When you're in position and someone bets, you just get to call and realize your equity very nicely. Whereas when you're out of position, you just need to raise immediately and hope you get action with your good hands, which, doesn't always happen. So that is it for today. When you are in position, you want to play wider ranges because position lets you better control the size of the pot and it gives you more information about your opponent's range. And because of that, play more hands from in position than out of position. That's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor and click the like and subscribe button down below. Also click the notification bell. Thank you all for being here today. If you have any other ideas for strategy segments we can make to help you fully understand the fundamentals of poker, type them down there. I read every single comment. Thanks for being here. Good luck in your games. And make sure you play more hands from in position than from out of position.